I'm Carys and Alona.
And I'm Alona Ferber, and you're listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar.
A weekly look at the stories in the news being overreported and the ones flying completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. My co-host this week is senior editor at Prospect Magazine, journalist, editor. She also has a brilliant Substack, Alona Ferber. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Carys. Thanks so much for having me on to one of my favourite podcasts. I'm delighted to be here.
It's lovely to hear. You're an editor, you're a senior editor. I'm really curious about what your media consumption habits are. Like, are you a news junkie? Are you getting all your news from social media? Are you reading physical papers? Like, how do you stay on top of the news?
I think I have a kind of a mix over the week. And this is partly, I'm also constantly fighting my own news fatigue as well, which makes things really difficult. So I'm like constantly soaking in news from various places. I read the papers, or I'm on social media all the time, or I'm kind of watching the news, but I also kind of don't really want to see anything that's happening at the same time as that. So it's a sort of weird mix, and a lot of emails as well, a lot of new email newsletters, a lot of looking at the news that way, various WhatsApp groups. What about you?
I get lots of newsletters and Substacks, and I go to news websites, I guess partly for this show. So I go to news websites because I'm interested in like what's trending. I watch a lot of TV news as well. So like Sky, BBC, just to get a sense of like what the main story is. I mean, it's been Iran for so long. But yeah, mine's also a mixed approach. And I often think I should systematize this a bit more. I get some news from WhatsApp. I've got a couple of very active like political group chats, which will break news to me. But yeah, I often think I started out working in PR in my 20s, and every morning we would sit and read all of the papers. Like we'd sit around the sofa.
How quaint.
I know, the Gen Zs could never, they have no idea. But I really enjoyed that. And we'd like mark up the papers. We did it, I did it in a couple of jobs, marking up the papers with Post-its, or when I was junior, it was my job to send around like a summary of it. And I miss when news was that simple, when it was just like physical papers and a couple of shows. But here we are in this deluge of information. Well, Alona and I have taken a look at the news agenda this week, and we've each picked one story that the media has gone over the top on and one that we think has flown under the radar and not been talked about enough. Alona, tell us your over the top.
Okay, so my over the top is quite controversial, Carys.
Oh, okay, we love it.
It's the Strait of Hormuz. Okay. I know it's really important.
We'll say, okay, for the three people listening that don't know what the Strait of Hormuz is, talk us through it and why you think it's over the top.
Okay, so the Strait of Hormuz is the point between Iran and Oman, through which like 20% of the world's oil exports go through, 80% of Iran's oil exports. And it's become the center of the news agenda since the Iran war started, because it's become this choke point for the world economy. Iran has been leveraging its position there. There's this fight between the US and Iran over the strait opening or not. Oil prices have gone up everywhere. Diesel prices, the economy is, we hear about this 24 hours a day at the moment. And it just feels like since the 28th of February, when this war started, when the US and Israel started a war against Iran, the story has been kind of overtaken by this channel through which oil passes through. I understand it's an important story, but it just feels like it's become the center of a much bigger story, to the detriment of the rest of the story.
I think you're right, because I would guess that people listening, and probably just most people on the street, had no idea what the Strait of Hormuz was 6 months ago.
Yes.
And I feel like now everyone's sort of an expert in it. And I have a theory about this. I agree with you. I think it's way over the top. Given everything that's going on, it gets a lot of attention. I think it's partly because journalists love to do the diagram. I feel like they love to get out a map and they love to put an arrow and a dot and be like, this is the Strait of Hormuz. Like, I just think it's a visual. And so everyone gets their graphic out. Otherwise, like, it is important, as you say, but it feels like there's just a sort of, then they get to bring up if it's TV, they get to bring up the map and zoom in and like point at the choke point and be like, I don't know. That's my theory. I don't know. But you're actually a journalist, actually editing a magazine. Why do you think it's getting so much attention? And what should we be talking about instead?
Or is that like the secret actually of journalism, that really it's all about the maps and the charts, and that it gets very convenient? And there's lots of amazing charts also now of like, how much oil goes through, how much jet fuel goes through, and how it's affecting prices here and there. And like, there's so many. It's so chart worthy. The Strait of Hormuz as a story. I mean, obviously, it was part of the story. It was part of what was happening throughout the war. It became Iran's kind of almost greatest point of kind of leverage over the US, and then became an aim for Donald Trump to reopen the strait, even though it wasn't closed to begin with. Really, it was an outcome of the war. So his war aim became something that was caused by the war.
Yeah, that kind of like, we're going to get the strait opened. It's like, it wasn't closed
Yes,
until you started bombing
that wasn't the issue. Exactly. And I think, obviously, I mean, again, I'm not saying it's not an important story, but we've kind of, it's almost as if we've forgotten how this war started, the fact that it was started. A lot of people make the case that it's an unjustified war, an illegal war. There's been a lot of death and destruction in the week since it was started. There's also the fact that, the war was started by two not very democratic, not very trustworthy leaders. I'm not saying, Iran is innocent at the regime, of all sorts of accusations, but it's as if we focus on this one story in this bigger story, and totally kind of, it's such an over the top, I think, because it's taken over the story of the war. When do we ever hear about Iranian casualties or how much damage has happened in Iran? We don't. We hear about the negotiations around the Strait of Hormuz. It's almost the only thing we hear about.
Yeah, you're right. And you're right. It's obscuring. And I'm not saying it's easy to report in Iran because they are not super open to having Western media famously. But I do think you're right. There's obviously a human cost to the war. There was the crazy chaos last week where Trump sort of threatened like nuclear weapons or annihilation over social media. And then Iranians were being told or encouraged to form human shields around bridges. And like, I don't know, I consume a lot of news and I don't know were any bridges blown up. Like the last real reporting I think we had on the human casualties was this awful attack on the girls' school that happened right at the start of the conflict. But yeah, I think you're right. There's very little on the human casualties and a lot on shipping. Like I know so much more about shipping than I ever wanted to know.
Shipping and jet fuel and,
fuel.
Trade flows.
And now Trump's blocking there's a new blockade. He's blocking somewhere else to stop Iran's oil going out. And it's like, I mean, in a sense, I guess people are focusing on what these like leaders care about most, which is like money and oil. But you're right. I think journalists are missing something that's quite important. I mean, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, I wonder if you think this too. I feel like for all the coverage of the Strait of Hormuz, why are we not talking about Lebanon?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Lebanon is almost like a side story in this story, the story of the war, which is, pretty crazy. And I think you had this moment after the ceasefire was announced, or the where Pakistan and Iran said it did include Lebanon, and Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, said it didn't, and Trump said, "Oh no, it doesn't." It's like, okay, as if it's not, as if they can disagree on it, kind of. There's no official line on it. It's so strange. And the attacks on Lebanon continue again, hundreds of people dead. You've got the situation where suddenly Israel and Lebanon are actually having direct talks. It's such a big story.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, they'd met to kind of to negotiate, where next or whatever. So yeah, it feels like Lebanon has been treated almost like a side story here. And at the same time, we're very, very much, we're hearing a lot about the Strait of Hormuz all the time. So you're absolutely right. I think it's another kind of strange outcome of this kind of slightly unbalanced coverage.
I mean, another thing I wanted to ask you about, because you write a lot about Middle Eastern politics, and I know you worked as a journalist in Israel. Tucker Carlson has been doing the rounds this week, right-wing kind of pro-Trump, former Fox News journalist, ideologue against the war in Iran. I mean, many people are, but like a lot of MAGA people are against it. And he's sort of been going around saying, this is all Benjamin Netanyahu's plan, and like Trump should never have listened to Israel. And I just wondered to what extent this feels different, as someone who follows Middle Eastern politics and writes about it. Like, to what extent does this feel different to other conflicts? And like, is that a fair? It looks like Netanyahu's the main person benefiting from this because he just seems to always want to be at war with people to boost his own political position. Is that fair?
I mean, he definitely, Netanyahu's sort of story with Iran goes back many, many years. He's focused on Iran as an enemy, for decades. And he definitely, we had the war last year against Iran where Israel started it, and then kind of they convinced the US to come in with bunker buster bombs to attack the Fordo underground nuclear facility. And at the time, it was clear that Israel was relying on America to do that. Otherwise, they would have been stuck in this kind of war of attrition. Who knows for how long? That finishes, and suddenly we're in February 2026. There's another war, and now we know there's been some really incredible reporting in the New York Times recently that Netanyahu, was working very, very hard to convince the Americans to do this, and partly telling the Americans, telling Trump a story that it would be very easy, that they would finish the job really quickly, get rid of the regime, everything would be brilliant, everybody would be happy with Trump, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think for Netanyahu, it's a bit at the moment, it's like, yes, he wants this because he is kind of ideologically committed to the idea of getting rid of the Iranian regime, but also it's convenient for him. He's on trial for corruption. He hasn't had to deal with the fallout from October 7th and the failings of his government in all sorts of ways in allowing that to happen. I don't think you can look at him as a good faith player. You can't assume that his motivations for starting anything are because he just kind of wants to do something he thinks is important. There's a lot of personal gain for him, political gain, but it's not clear that he's getting the electoral gain he wants out of it in Israel. There'll be an election in October, and the polling doesn't show that he's got a big bump from the war.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
I mean, partly it could be that, Israelis are unhappy about all sorts of things, so it wasn't quite enough. There's a lot of damage and destruction. A lot of people have died in Israel too. But also now there's this kind of ceasefire and they haven't actually achieved the aims of the war. And there's polling showing that most Israelis are against the ceasefire because they've been told for weeks, this is a just war and we're going to finish everything and we're going to win and blah, blah, blah. So they're probably thinking, hang on a second, you didn't do any of the things you promised. This war hasn't worked out how you said it would.
To bring it back to the Strait, I feel like that is really, for me, the heart of why the Strait of Hormuz is over the top, because the political motivations and like machinations behind this war feel like the thing that we need to understand and know about. And you mentioned there's a brilliant New York Times piece that we can link to in the show notes that is like kind of terrifying because it's like a behind the scenes and how the war came about. And Netanyahu is definitely very involved in like personally briefing Trump, people in the Situation Room. Like, yeah, the Tucker Carlson claim doesn't look so wild in the context of the reporting. But yeah, I would love to understand more about, for both of these leaders who are mired in scandals, like what is this really a conflict about distracting people? What was the goal? Because yeah, it's such a shit show now. It sort of feels even more important to understand like what the motivations were and what people are trying to do and get out of it, and less important to know about the little bit of that map, which
which is an outcome of the war and is important, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not the biggest story. I mean, there are other stories, right? Another bigger story is the Strait of Hormuz, and obviously this has been discussed a lot, shows us that reliance on fossil fuels is very unsustainable for all sorts of reasons, and in this situation, it's so easy to cause total chaos in the global economy. But we're still looking at that map, talking about the blockade, kind of updating.
Yeah.
Like
everyone's a shipping expert. Everyone now knows about where everyone gets their oil.
I know where it is on a map. I can find the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
It's right here. But I think also like, that when you made this point about like, you want to know more about what it is that's brought this war about, kind of, you've got these two leaders who neither of which are good faith actors, and a big part of the story is, like how, or a big story that we need to be thinking about is how has Trump been emboldened by the things America did in Iran last year, by what happened in Venezuela this year. And given that in that story, you read about how much Trump sort of ignored all the advisors around him who said, this is a bad idea. There's a story about a leader who just sort of does what he wants and doesn't listen to anyone. I don't know, that's another
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. One of the many, many stories. Also, well, we probably don't have time for it now, but also like the weird propaganda coming from everyone. I don't know if a few friends have sent me the weird AI Lego
Oh
things that
yeah.
Iran's
Oh
putting
yeah.
out. Like, yeah, there's so much going on in this conflict. And I feel like the little shipping, that little tiny gap that ships can or cannot pass through feels like, yeah, not the most important thing. This podcast exists because 350 people choose to pay for it each month. That's it. A few hundred people donate a few pounds each on Patreon, and we can make this show for thousands of you, completely ad-free. I'll be honest, right now those 350 people only cover our basic production costs. We need more supporters so the podcast can continue to exist and grow. We need more supporters so the podcast can continue to grow. The Patreon community gets a bonus episode of the show, a weekly behind-the-scenes newsletter, and access to the over-under WhatsApp community. Go to patreon.com/over-the-top under the radar to support us. If you choose to donate on Patreon, it means everyone can get the show every week ad-free. And you'll be supporting independent left-wing media, not beholden to shareholders or billionaire owners. My over-the-top for the week is Melania Trump. Really want to talk about Melania with you, partly because you have a feminist Substack, so I feel like we're going to have good chats. But also for those who weren't paying attention or haven't turned the TV on in the last week, in the middle of all of these like headlines about Iran, about the ceasefire, about the talks, J.D. Vance, Pakistan, on the 9th of April, Melania Trump, wife of Donald Trump, First Lady of the United States, made a surprise statement about Jeffrey Epstein. So I'm not saying that journalists shouldn't have covered this because it was quite bizarre. She gave this address, which no one apparently knew about, including Trump, if the reports to be believed, in the White House behind a podium. And she gave what was a fairly bizarre statement, denying any relationship with Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell, denying she was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein, and generally saying anyone who reports anything about me and Epstein that's inaccurate, I will sue you. She also, which I do just want to give a little shout out for, made a plug to her book, Melania, which I was just like, I respect the hustle. She's like, I'm coming out here to clear my name about Epstein. And if you want to know everything, buy my book. I will not be buying her book. But I mean, so I think there's sort of two parts to this. This grabbed lots of headlines, and from news outlets, and lots of comedians and satirists had a field day. The statement was a bit bizarre. It was kind of the equivalent of that meme where it's like, no one. And then it's like, no one else to this. It's not really clear where it came from. It wasn't the most effective defense because no one was talking about it. It pushes Epstein back into the headlines, which Trump definitely doesn't want. So it was bizarre. And I mean, just to give an indication, both SNL UK and SNL America ran Melania Trump skits over the weekend. It was gold for satirists. Jimmy Kimmel did a monologue, etc., etc. I don't want to, stop people from having fun, but I do think we went a little bit over the top in a couple of ways. The first is, I think there's this weird fascination with Melania Trump and the Trumps' marriage that feels like it's basically celebrity gossip. There was the big hat that she wore to the inauguration, and I think people enjoy writing this sort of storyline that she doesn't like her husband, they're not really in love, she thinks he's an idiot. And again, it's a funny bit, but I don't know. And this speech became another proof of that, of she's bringing Epstein up, which is the last thing that he wants. And I just was a bit I don't know. Do you feel sometimes I'm just a bit I feel like we're getting a tabloid fascination with her rather than dissecting what she actually said in the statement. Some of which did contradict what Trump has called for. She was Congress needs to investigate this. And it was he definitely doesn't think that should happen. So I think that's the one thing. And then the second thing that which does frustrate me, is that on the 9th of April, Melania made this wild statement that none of us saw coming and was quite bizarre. But on the 8th of April, the former Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who people might remember, she appeared before Congress and gave a really bizarre sort of appearance where she ignored the Epstein victims and just kept talking about the Dow and how great President Trump was. Well, Pam got fired and Congress subpoenaed her. And the day before Melania gave her weird Epstein speech, Pam Bondi's attorney said, we're not complying with the subpoena. we're not coming to Congress. So the day before the Melania speech, the former Attorney General basically says, no, I'm not going to the Oversight Committee. This is like a congressional committee that voted majority 24-19. So Republicans and Democrats were agreed, we need to talk to this woman. And then she said, I'm not coming. And then this week, she just didn't turn up. She just no-showed. That, for me, feels like the more important part of the Epstein story and like the endless attempts to try and get some accountability from the Trump administration. But I'm curious about what you think. What do you think of Melania's?
That statement. I mean, it's just like, I agree with you. Great plug for her book in there. It reads like, obviously it's been written with the help of lawyers and advisors. It's a very carefully worded statement. She is sort of seen almost like either she's like an absurd figure, a kind of caricature, or she's like, like a victim, like she's sort of being held against her will by Trump. I think she's much more kind of smart and kind of wily than that in a way. She knows exactly what she's doing. She chose, that there's all the sorts of stuff in the statement about like political enemies trying to kind of frame her and rumors on social media. Nobody knows what she means. Nobody apparently expected it. No one knows what like, I didn't steal the car. What car?
What? The car got stolen?
Yeah. What are you talking about? But I think, it's a bit like the Strait of Hormuz. It's like, what's actually happening, not in a conspiratorial way, but, it's very, very interesting that she decided to give this statement. You're right. The Pam Bondi story is clearly more important than this statement. But, what is this really a story about what the whole Epstein scandal is in American politics? Or, is there some story about how, because there were rumors, right, that she was a victim of Epstein, maybe, and that's the thing she's kind of like, the statement is about, it's about her saying, I wasn't one of his victims. But yeah, it's like, if you just report a statement by the First Lady, it's not really, right, the old saying, it's not journalism, it's PR. You need to you don't just report what somebody wants you to have said that they said. You have to find out what's actually going on. So I can see why you're saying it's an over.
And you're right, there's definitely, because there is some context to it that is potentially interesting. But again, I don't know that we've had any of the kind of investigatory reporting that we need, is that after Epstein was released from prison the first time for like soliciting a minor, and after his sort of awful sex ring in Florida was exposed, she changed tactics in how he's procuring women and switched from sort of targeting like young white working class American girls to targeting Eastern European women. So there is like a not completely implausible connection then between Melania, who is Eastern European. Again, yeah, it's really unclear what prompted it, because the document dump, because the other thing is that there's an email exchange between her and Ghislaine Maxwell that was in the last Epstein file drop, but that was like quite some time ago. So it's like, is she really just that behind on her inbox that she didn't clock that she'd been mentioned? Like, it was just, the timing about it is super weird, and I think it is worth investigating. But yeah, the Pam Bondi thing, like, meanwhile, for me, the biggest story seems to be it was November 2025 that the Trump administration was told it needed to release Epstein files. Pam Bondi is like refusing to be held accountable. The new, like, he's an acting attorney general, like he doesn't formally have the job. But on his first day, he said Epstein should not be part of anything going forward at the Department of Justice. So like, it feels like the real story is the Trump administration is going to try and shut down any further inquiry into Epstein, and like use the Melania Trump speech as an excuse to write that story. Like, don't just sort of pile back into like mocking her or psychoanalyzing her. She's spoken a lot about feeling that she's been overlooked compared to other first ladies. She hasn't been on the cover of Vogue, and in that quite Trumpian way, she's been like, I don't even care. I don't even want to be on the cover of Vogue, like whatever. But they're clearly biased. So I am sort of intrigued about what her like propaganda. It's definitely a thing with celebrities now of like, I'm going to have a tell-all documentary that the Beckhams did it very well on Netflix. So I'm a bit intrigued by like what hers would be like, and just how kind of unsubtle and weird, and like what she wants us to think about her. So that's my over the top. What's your under the radar?
My under the radar is a slightly more sober one, I'm afraid, than Melania Trump. This is a very serious story. It is about the really, really continually terrible maternity crisis, which is kind of one of those stories which has been kind of reported to death and yet is still under the radar. somehow. It's completely crazy to me. So on the 5th of April, the Sunday Times published an investigation on deaths in pregnancy, labor, or in the postnatal period. And the stats are completely unbelievable. So they found that, first of all, that they're at the highest level for 2 decades, even though we've had so many reviews, recommendations, that this keeps going up. I'll just read out some of the stats from the piece. Over that decade, there was a 50% rise in the UK's maternal death rate, from 8.54 deaths per 100,000 pregnancies in 2013 to 12.8 in 2023. The last time the rate was this high was 2025. Over the past decade, there have been 748 recommendations issued across 59 official reports, and death rates have still gone up. I have 2 more stats I'm going to share with you. So the leading cause of death in the postnatal period is suicide. Okay, that's gone up 74% since 2019. And despite numerous recommendations, 22 according to the Times, racial disparities in maternity care are still so bad that Black women are 3 times more likely to die than white women. So all these things, and the thing is with this, it's like, and what the Times investigation did, they looked at various instances where there had been warnings during a labor. So a woman is feeling some sort of pain, has some sort of a symptom that should be a warning, a red warning sign, and it's ignored. And then the woman has died. Something happens. In all of these, if you look across now, there's the Amos review is underway now, and it's meant to report. The final report comes out.
Is that a government review?
Government review. That was commissioned by Wes Streeting. But we already know, like, there've been so many reviews, there's so much reporting, so many recommendations, and still it feels like this is a story that's kind of just like, okay, fine, can move on to the next thing.
It completely flew under my radar, and I don't think it got picked up any more widely by the Sunday Times, right? It kind of ran, and then no one else said anything.
No, every once in a while there's a story. The Times are quite good at reporting on the maternity crisis, and every once in a while they'll run a story. I mean, people report on the maternity crisis regularly, but it's as if it doesn't make a dent. It's like it's a really odd thing, and we could talk, I'm sure, for a long time about why it's so kind of uninteresting to people.
Well, I think we should get into it, because on the face of it shouldn't be, right? Because women are more than half the population, or at least half the population in most countries, and everyone was born and lots of people become mothers. So it feels like something that's like obviously of interest to a lot of people. I mean, why do you think it doesn't get picked up?
There's a very basic kind of, reason around the way we're not interested in things that happen to women. We're not interested, we hate women, I would say. I don't personally hate women. Maybe I do. I don't know. But there's some sort of misogyny sort of happening here. By the way, today, the government released a women's health strategy, which doesn't relate to maternity. And the strategy, I think, or Wes Streeting in the statement about it, the health secretary mentions misogyny. The strategy, like the press release from the government that says that women will be listened to. There's a big story here is about how women are not listened to when they go through the health services. And the same thing happens when you're having a baby. A woman says she's in pain, something's wrong, and she's kind of ignored. Within the system, you've got these burnt out midwives who kind of have no sympathy anymore for the women going through the system. But also, whenever anybody talks about, big strategies to fix the NHS, it's like maternity is always, it's never the top priority. When the pandemic happened, it was one of the first places where they started like putting in restrictions and cutting things back. And like you said, everyone's born. There's always, birth will happen. There's nothing you can, it's not a disease you will one day solve. Like people will keep having babies. And it just seems like, surely if this wasn't a thing that mostly affected women and that mostly women work in, it would be a bigger deal to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to go further and say that if men gave birth, we just would not be like, if men gave birth and we found out that like a record number of men were killing themselves after giving birth to a child, I just think we'd get more coverage, Yeah, I think you're right. There's a couple of things there. Like one, some of those stats are genuinely shocking, and the like ongoing racism in maternity deaths and like how Black women are so much more likely to like have a negative birth experience or to die as a result of giving birth to a child is terrible. And there's something about that suicide statistic just is so shocking, because presumably that is about women who are experiencing postnatal depression that's not being detected. And it just feels like such a treatable and preventable thing. And I think it is hard to see those numbers and not feel like it isn't about misogyny and sexism, which just like pervades all of the healthcare system. And like, yes, the NHS is under strain, but this is, I think, yeah, particularly shocking. The other reason I think it's weird is you talked us through the numbers. And the other thing that can often get media interest is having like case study stories and like women's real experiences. And like, just going to say it, a lot of my friends have had children, and I would say a good chunk of them have had fairly traumatic births. So it's not even that hard to cast around for people who've had a really negative experience with the maternity system. It's so common. And yeah, it does just feel almost willful to not talk about this more and not pick up the Sunday Times like story more. Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, in the context of all of the other things, inequalities with women's health, yeah, it's hard to see it as much more than sexism, really. I don't know. Is there something else I'm missing?
Yeah, I think it. I mean, I think it is. I think it's about sexism. It's about women undervaluing themselves as well. It's like a kind of like internalized misogyny. And I have the same experience where, you know, most of the people I know who've been through the NHS and had kids have had at least at some point a traumatic or difficult experience. It's just so common. It's not that it's like it's been reported once and everyone's ignored it. The thing is, it's under the radar, even though it's been kind of reported repeatedly and there've been all these reviews. It's still kind of not that suicide statistic is really shocking. We talk a lot about male loneliness, men and boys are lost, they have no place in the world. Why aren't we talking about the fact that women are dying by suicide after they have babies? And it's not just about medical care, it's also about the fact that there's no community support. People are really lonely. They have nowhere to go. They're alone with a child all day. And it can be really difficult, especially if you're vulnerable to depression anyway. That's another thing that we're not really talking about. All the things that were in place to support a family after they have a baby are sort of gone. Like there's not, depends where you live. Where I live, there's no council funding really for any kind of activities when you've had for babies. So everything's done by churches, and the churches happen to have volunteers and a bit of money. But if they didn't do it, nobody would do it. And then people would just be at home alone, I guess.
And yeah, and it's another example of how stripping back the public sector has all of these consequences that are really terrible and really costly. Like, you're making like children, if a woman kills herself, the child doesn't have a mother, a family has lost someone. And but I do think you've hit on something really important, which sort of, I guess, goes beyond the media underreporting, which is just how much of pregnancy and motherhood is steeped in shame, and how much women are shamed for their experiences, for how they are as mothers, for how that, I had a friend who had to have a cesarean and she felt really guilty because she's like, oh, I feel like I failed and I didn't do it properly. And I was like, oh my God, but I think there's so much about pregnancy, motherhood for women that is like another excuse to shame them or make them feel bad about themselves. So maybe that's also then creating a culture of silence or a taboo where people can't say, I've had a baby and I'm meant to feel all of this love and joy and happiness, but actually I feel like I don't want to be here and I don't want to be a mum. So yeah, it feels like a media conversation is like the first part of a conversation that can then help us to like deal with the problem. It's a good not good news, but like a really important one. And yeah, if you're listening and have been affected by it, we'd love to hear from you. Love to talk about it more on the show. And if you work, I don't know, for the RCN or work in maternity care, I'd love to hear your experiences as well. So my under the radar is less upsetting, but also not good news. You have probably seen this, Alona, because you work in the media and you consume media. I have not seen it picked up very much. My under the radar is the sale of the Telegraph newspaper media outlet. So for those who haven't been following, the right-wing broadsheet, the Telegraph, it's had some financial trouble for some time now. It's kind of its own story. It's like very Succession-esque. The Barclay brothers, the old owner, massive loans. There's like weird secret recordings. It's all very bizarre. But the upshot of it is, for the last 3 years, the Telegraph has needed a new owner. And there have been a couple of bids that have been turned down, one because of foreign ownership. But this week, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has approved a bid from a German media company to buy the Telegraph Media Group for, I think it's £575 million. I think this has flown under the radar. Well, one, it just hasn't been picked up that much. But two, I think we should be paying attention to this sale, partly because of who's buying the Telegraph, but also because I think it's about a bigger trend in media. So the Telegraph was bought by a company called Axel Springer, which is German. And its chief executive is Matthias Dopfner. I'm definitely not pronouncing his name right. So he is a German right-wing media baron. He owns Politico, he owns Business Insider, and soon he will own the Telegraph. You might be wondering, why is he interested in buying a British newspaper? He has tried to buy the Telegraph before. He has got a sort of plan, vision, strategy to build a centre-right media empire. He knows that he owns, German language newspapers, but he believes that English language outlets are the way to have influence. And so he's bought the paper. I think the things that worry me about it are, number one, he has like really clear ties to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. His son worked for Peter Thiel, or like Peter Thiel's family office. And he set up his own venture capital fund that was seeded with $50 million from Peter Thiel. And I'm guessing most people who listen know who Peter Thiel is. He's like one of these shady tech billionaires. He's got wildly problematic views about migration. His company Palantir has like a number of public sector contracts that worry lots of us. So like one of Peter Thiel and Elon Musk's pals has bought the Daily Telegraph. And I think that is concerning and worrying. And then I think the second thing about this as I feel like it's frustrating that it's flown under the radar is this is part of a bigger trend towards consolidation of UK media and global media in the hands of a few very rich, very right-wing men. The Telegraph being sold to Dopfner now means that pretty much all newspapers in the UK, with the exception of the Daily Mirror and Express, which are owned by Reach, and The Guardian, which is owned by a charitable foundation, are now owned by like right-wing men who have a clear ideological agenda and who, in pretty much all cases, whether it's Dopfner, whether it's Murdoch, Lord Rothermere in the Mail, like pretty clear evidence that the editorial output of those newspapers is influenced by the political leanings of the owners. And Dopfner, there was a leak that he specifically gave instructions to the editor of Bild, the German newspaper he owns, to strengthen the FDP 2 days before the German election. So a rich right-wing guy's bought the Telegraph. It's part of his bigger media empire plan, and we're not really talking about it, and we're not really talking about who owns our media. What do you think, Alona? Did it fly under your radar, or you've been following it, I guess?
I mean, I guess I'm kind of aware of these sorts of stories just because I work in the media, and it's one of those business stories that, yeah, if you're not kind of in the sector, you might not be paying attention, but often those stories are really, really important. We should really care about who owns our media, who is producing our information, who is providing that public service to people, which is media. What is news for? It's for, informing people about their world. It's for holding power to account. It's all of those things. Axel Springer, like you said, they wanted to buy the Telegraph before. They tried to buy the Financial Times. Nikkei Asia bought it instead. That's a Japanese company. So I guess part of the story is also that, British newspapers are somehow a prestige thing for these big global companies, which I think is really interesting. He has said the Telegraph will be independent, and he said that like you said, he wants to create this center-right media outlet, basically, out of the Telegraph. And one of the things that I thought about with this story was, okay, could it be that actually this brings the Telegraph back from its current state, where the opinion pages, I mean, there's stuff on there that is not center-right in any way, but much closer to the further reaches of the right? Does it make the Telegraph a force against, for example, the kind of populist, hard right, far right politics of a party like Reform, if you end up with a newspaper that isn't sort of providing a platform for this like these kind of reform sort of talking points. So there's a potential where actually this, if you look at Politico, which they also own, Politico is generally respected, a kind of century right voice that's kind of quote unquote sensible. Could it be that actually this is better for British media? That's a slight, just a slight counterpoint. Could that be actually like not a
It's the Peter Thiel thing that worries me. It's the Peter
that is
Thiel, Elon
worrying.
Musk
That's
pals
worrying.
with
Yeah.
those guys because they're not like centre
No.
right. They're hard
No.
right. I mean, you're right. The Telegraph is I don't know how much worse the Telegraph could get in terms of like, as you say, like how sort of pro reform and increasingly outlierish it's got. I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it is really relevant to this, is Paul Marshall, who is the other person who's brought up media brands. And I think that you're right. There's clearly, I mean, the Telegraph does actually make money. It's got lots of paying subscribers for print, partly about the demographic of people that read the Telegraph. They, tend to be a bit older, tend to want to read physical newspapers. They've got digital subscribers. So actually, putting aside all the chaos of the Barclay brothers, it's like a sound investment. But I guess the Dopner stuff made me think about Paul Marshall, who bought The Spectator, which I think Axel Springer also at one point wanted to buy. He owns The Spectator, he owns GB News, and he owns Unheard. And I think he's another right-wing wealthy man who made his money running a hedge fund. And Paul Marshall, I think, sort of epitomizes why this like media trend for me feels worrying. Like, let's be honest, newspapers have pretty much always been owned by wealthy men or wealthy families. But, if you go back to the 1930s, there would have been a few rich white men that owned British newspapers. But I do think this trend of sort of right-wing wealthy people buying up media outlets, you could look at Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post in America. I think something different's going on because these people are buying papers to have influence. They don't own papers and therefore are influential. And Paul Marshall in particular, like he is making a massive loss on GB News. I don't think on The Spectator, but like he's buying it to have influence. And I guess that's what when you look at sort of Dopner and his bio and his friends, it's like he's buying the Telegraph to buy influence. And I think that should be concerning to all of us. I mean, you're right, we don't know what the impact will be on the editorial line. And he has committed to, he says he's committed to editorial independence. He wants to take the Telegraph from strength to strength. But this is also someone who at other media outlets has required people to sign pledges like affirming Israel's right to exist, supporting the alliance between the US and Europe. Like there's a sort of constitution of values that he makes journalists sign up to. So like for me, it doesn't pass the sniff test that it won't have any impact. But yeah, I wondered what you thought about that, this sort of weird consolidation. And you're obviously you work for a magazine that isn't owned by like a right-wing billionaire that's come into
but we are owned by someone, so I mean, you're right that like all kind of so much of media is owned, right? Non-profit media that runs via donations or whatever is kind of growing as well, like lots of independent Substacks and stuff doing amazing journalism. But most establishment media, certainly here, is owned by someone. The consolidation thing is worrying because everything consolidates, there's less there's less of a marketplace of ideas. Jeff Bezos is obviously the worst example of what can happen, where he sort of bought this thing and then gutted it, and also very
fired
much
loads of journalists.
and very much influenced the editorial line and made it a not independent newspaper. At some point, I remember he announced that from now on, the opinion page will only publish opinion that is supportive of free markets, and I don't remember what else. So that can happen. Or, we have a sort of like a Hungary situation. Orbán's luckily lost the election, but he spent years working to control the media so that he wouldn't be able to be voted out. Obviously, media consolidation is a real problem. The Bild, so the biggest newspaper that they own in Germany, the Bild, which is a big tabloid, is a big tabloid, which does tabloidy things and is kind of contrarian and, it's not necessarily like the kind of a great kind of, voice for kind of pluralism and kind of tolerance in Germany. I guess it's one of those wait and see moments, but I agree with you that it's an under, because as we're discussing, there are so many issues at stake here. Like, who owns our media? How consolidated is it? How free is it? How, if you're a British person or a person living here in the UK and you want to choose where you get your information from, how much choice do you really have if there are fewer owners across the different media outlets that you can read?
I think you've hit on an interesting point, because at the moment, and Lisa Nandy has waved this through, other deals have been blocked, but at the moment in the UK, media regulation says if you have a newspaper that has 20% of the circulation, you can't buy a TV channel. But the thing that isn't being applied is people like Paul Marshall, Dopfner, like right now, like online titles and online outlets, which is obviously most of our news consumption now, aren't included in that mix. So you could buy up a ton of websites with huge circulation. You could buy newspapers and magazines, and you wouldn't break that 2020 rule to give a TV license. And, how many people even want a TV license nowadays? So like there's definitely a need to look at the regulation. And I think the final thing I'd say is, it's easy if your politics don't align with the Telegraphs to be like, well, I don't really care who owns a Telegraph. But I think, to go back to 24-year-old Carys flipping through newspapers, our broadsheet and tabloid newspapers in the UK do help to set the TV agenda. They help set the parliamentary agenda. Like people, the BBC and like other Sky News, other channels will be reading newspapers to help to decide what stories they're going to flag. And so the Telegraph impacts the whole media ecosystem in the UK, even if you're not a dedicated Telegraph reader. I mean, the Telegraph were running a ton of green attack stories in the Gorton and Denton by-election, like digging into Hannah Spencer. So it's not something that only Telegraph readers should care about, because that's not how media ecosystems work. They're all sort of in conversation with each other. So yeah, maybe needs a bit more attention. Definitely one to pay. Yes, you say, wait and see. We will soon find out what the impact is.
Yeah, and let's hope Peter Thiel has nothing to do with the Telegraph in any way.
Yeah, please no. Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining me, Alona. And thank you for listening. If you sign up to support us at patreon.com/overthetop/under-the-radar, you can hear more with Alona. We're going to talk about the upcoming elections in Israel and strongman politics. Alona, where can people find you and your work?
So you are very welcome to come and look at Prospect Magazine or subscribe to Prospect Magazine. We're prospectmagazine.co.uk. You can also sign up to my Substack. Obviously, I had to say that.
Great Substack.
Backlash. Thank you so much, Carys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.